video, I'm going to talk about a lot of the little details about monopolies. Not so much the mathematical or really technical details, but some of the general ideas that we want to understand when we talk about monopolies. So first, let's just review the characteristics of a monopoly. It's really the total opposite of pure competition. Pure competition at one extreme is a lot of little sellers who have no control over the price, all producing the same thing. And there's such cutthroat competition that they all have to sell at the same price. And in the long run, they're not going to be making any profit, at least not any extraordinary profit. They're just going to make the minimum that they need in order to want to keep going in the industry. So at the total opposite of the spectrum is pure monopoly. And so with a pure monopoly, there is a single seller. And so when you talk about the firm, the business, since there's only one, really that one business is identical to talking about the entire industry, since there's only the one firm. Also, when we talk about a pure monopoly, there is no supply curve. Why not? Well, the definition of a supply curve, if you recall, is what quantity will be supplied in the market at each market price. Since there's not really a market price and there's only one firm, there's not a supply curve. Now there's going to be something that looks like the supply curve that comes from the marginal cost curve, right? But we're just going to call it a marginal cost curve when we're talking about a monopolist. We're not going to call it a supply curve anymore. Now, in order to be a real monopoly, you have to be selling something where there are no close substitutes for the product that we're talking about. So it doesn't really make sense to talk about someone being a monopolist if there's something else that people could buy that is pretty much the same thing. It's such a close substitute that you could buy either one or the other. If they're that close of a substitute, there's some competition there. It's not really what we would think about as being a monopoly. So this monopoly, this one firm, is a price maker as opposed to being a price taker. Pure competition, every firm takes the market price as given and has no control over it. But if you're the one firm, you have all the control in the world over price, except you have to understand that even if you're the one firm, you can't repeal the law of demand. You have to understand that as you raise the price, the quantity people buy is going to go down. So you can choose any price you want, and that's going to determine the quantity people want to buy. Or conversely, you can think about it as you can choose to sell any quantity you want, but the quantity is going to dictate the price you can sell it for. You have to pick a point on the demand curve, in other words, if you're a monopolist. You just get to pick whatever point it is that maximizes the profits for you. Assumption number 5 is that there's got to be a good reason why there's only one firm in this market, especially if they're going to be making any profits. So we assume that entry into this industry has to be blocked. So there's only one firm because there's something keeping other firms out. And we'll talk about a list in just a second of a lot of good reasons why there might just be one firm. Also, a monopolist, once they're a monopolist and they're the only firm and they're dictating the price and they're picking a point on the demand curve, they may or may not engage in non-price competition, such as advertising. But it kind of depends on what kind of product it is we're talking about. A monopolist might advertise. This is probably the most common thing that a monopolist would do that's non-price competition. Since they have to pick one point on the demand curve, they might advertise in order to increase the demand. So just to jot down a quick example here, if you're a monopolist, price, quantity, suppose this is your demand curve, and you might find that this is the best price quantity combination for you. I don't know, it might be $100 and 200 units. If you can advertise and make people believe that your product is more valuable and that they should buy it because it's healthy or something like that, or it's fashionable, then maybe you can increase people's willingness and ability to buy your product. And then there might be another point over here where you could sell at a higher price, say $120, but even sell more, maybe 300 units after you increase the demand. It might be a good investment for you if you're a monopolist. So let's talk about some barriers to entry. What are some things out there that might make it so that there might only be one firm, or if we're talking about an oligopoly where there's just a few firms, what are some things that might be a barrier to keep other firms from coming in and competing and reducing our monopoly power in the market? Well, example number one, there might just be a legal barrier to entry. There might be a law that says you're the only firm that's allowed to do this. As strange as it may sound, in many, many countries, there are such laws that says the state or some company is the only company allowed to produce a certain kind of good. Now, an example that's a favorite of mine is in the United States. The United States Postal Service is a monopoly. Now, they are a quasi, which means sort of, government organization, but there's a law that says that in the United States, the only people allowed to deliver first class mail is the United States Postal Service. And there's federal law, Title 18, Section 1725, and this law says that they're the only ones allowed to deliver first class mail. And first class mail means it's a letter in an envelope that gets put in a mailbox. So that's really what the U.S. Postal Service has a monopoly on, is putting things in mailboxes and taking things out of mailboxes. If anybody else puts anything in a mailbox and it doesn't have the correct postage on it, then if you're a business, you could have a $10,000 fine for every item you put in somebody's mailbox. Now, if you're just an individual person, the fine is capped at $5,000, but that's high enough, I think, for me. So, of course, there are other businesses that deliver packages in addition to the United States Postal Service delivering packages. And for many years, Federal Express and UPS have been asking Congress in the United States to allow them to deliver first-class mail. They say, look, we could do it faster, we could do it cheaper, and we could charge less for the stamps. We could do it more reliably than the U.S. Postal Service does. Just let us have a crack at it. But Congress has, as of yet, not passed such a law to allow these other companies to also deliver first-class mail. Now, another kind of law that might keep somebody out of an industry and allow there to be a monopolist, at least for a certain kind of product or service, is patents and copyrights. Patents are for if you invent an invention, a new thing that's not obvious, that is a new piece of technology or a new way of doing things. So patents are for processes, patents are for drugs, patents are for other kinds of inventions. And basic idea is for a patent lasts 20 years in the United States. So there are different kinds of patents and there are some exceptions and some other rules, but the basic idea is for patents filed on or after 1995, the term of the patent is basically 20 years. So that means that for those 20 years that you are the monopolist, you are the exclusive person that can make that product or allow people to use that process, unless you want to license it and somebody can pay you money and then they can use your product. But you have total control over it for 20 years. Now, after 20 years is up, then anyone can make this product or use this process without having to pay you any money anymore. Now, copyrights are for things like books, software, movies, poems, lyrics, songs. So anything that's either written down or something artistic, maybe like a photograph. Let's talk about copyrights and how they work, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. Let's talk about how long a copyright lasts. And this is a section from the United States government's website. Different countries are going to have different laws about this, but basically in the United States, the term of a copyright for a particular work depends on a lot of different things. But as a general rule, if something was created after 1978, copyright protection lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years. So a good long time. But the idea is that the creator of a work ought to have control over it and be able to make money off of it if it's something people actually want for their lifetime, and then maybe their kids and their grandkids can make some money off of it as well. But again, with copyright, you need to be a copyright lawyer in order to understand all the details because there are a lot of exceptions. Here's one of the big misunderstandings that I hear a lot. How do you get something patented versus how do you get something copywritten? Well, with a patent, if you want a patent on something, you have to actually fill out a lot of paperwork, do a lot of research, and usually hire a lawyer who is a specialist in patent law. Because what they have to do is we have to fill out a lot of paperwork and do research to prove that no one has patented or invented this thing that you're saying that you invented before. And you have to prove that what you invented was non-obvious. It can't be just something that anybody could have thought up at any time. It has to be non-obvious, and there are a lot of other technical rules as well. So in order to get a patent, you have to fill out a lot of paperwork, probably pay a lawyer, or spend a lot of your own time learning how to do this, and you have to pay a lot of fees to the United States Patent Office or whatever country you want to patent it in. It could be multiple countries that you want to do this in. And you have to go through the process, which is expensive and time consuming, in order to get it approved. And it's only after it's approved that you really have this protection. Now, with a copyright, it's very, very different. What do you have to do to copyright something? Well, here's a handout that we were just going through. Let me show you how we can copyright it. Okay, so here's the handout that we were looking at a second ago. Let me show you how to copyright it. Boom, it's copywritten. So technically, we don't have to do anything in order to copyright it. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. Now, if you want to be a little more careful, you can declare to the world to make sure they know that you intend that this is yours and that you don't want other people to use it. So we could copyright it this way. We could write copyright by Mark Berkey here. And now it's definitely copywritten. This tells the world that this is mine, it's not yours, you're not allowed to copy this without my permission, you're not allowed to use this without my permission. And if you want to be a little bit more particular, you can put a date on there. So you could put a year, like 2018 or something, whenever you created it. So this is definitely copywritten now. Now there's a lot of misunderstandings about how you can copyright things. Let's look at the details. So this is from the United States Copyright Office page. It says, when is my work protected by copyright? Your work is under copyright protection the moment it is created and fixed in a tangible form that is perceptible either directly or with the aid of a machine or a device. So this means as soon as you create whatever it is you're creating, a document, as long as you create it in a fixed, tangible form that is perceptible either directly or with the aid of a machine or device. So you could create a document on your computer. Bam, it's copywritten automatically. You don't have to file any paperwork. You don't have to do anything. As soon as you created it, it's yours. Now, the problem comes if you need to sue someone to prevent them from using something you created. You probably need some way to prove that you created it and also prove when you created it. So this is when the details get a little bit more hairy. But technically, as soon as you create something in a fixed form, it's copywritten. So if you and some buddies were working on a song and you were singing the song and playing your guitars and your drums and playing your instruments, that's not copywritten because it's not in a fixed form. But as soon as you record that song on somebody's phone, then it's automatically copywritten. So the Copyright Office says, do I have to register with your office to be protected? No. Registration is voluntary. Copyright exists from the moment the work is created. So you don't have to register with a Copyright Office. You don't have to pay a dime to anyone. However, if you want to sue someone, if you register it, it certainly is easier because then there's proof of who created it and when it was created. But there are certainly a lot of other ways to prove when something was created. You could have some witnesses, all right? This handout is copywritten, and I have all of you people as witnesses. And I've made a video showing this handout. And I assert that I created the handout, and therefore it's mine. And so, hey, nobody used this without my permission. Now just ask me if you want to use it, and that's fine, right? So patents and copyrights prevent other people from using your inventions or your other kinds of creative works without your permission. So you're a monopolist in that song that you wrote or that poem that you wrote. You are a monopolist in that drug that a drug firm spent a lot of money creating. Nobody else can sell that same drug after it gets patented, at least for 20 years. Now, another example is there might be a case where somebody's a monopolist because there's one person or one company that owns a resource that you need in order to make a certain thing. As an example, a big company called the Aluminum Company of America, or Alcoa for short, at one point, no longer, but at one point in the United States history, they owned all the known resources where you could get aluminum ore, and this aluminum ore is called bauxite. And so this is a picture inside an aluminum making plant where they have the molten aluminum being poured down here. So this is a good way that you could become a monopolist. If you need a certain kind of material to make airplanes and you're the only one who has that material, then of course no one else would be able to make airplanes except for you. Number 4, barrier to entry. Firms often try to create barriers to entry themselves. One way that you can create barriers to entry is to use a lot of advertising. If you don't want people getting in and competing with you, make sure that people know that you're the only brand name that counts. And if you're not buying from them, you're just getting something that's of low quality or something that people are going to laugh at you. So this is a barrier to entry. It's telling anybody that wants to produce the same goods you are that they're going to have to also spend millions of dollars in advertising in order to get started in this market. And it's a way to deter people, to try to keep them out. Another barrier to entry that's kind of similar that I've seen before is if you want to be a monopolist, buy your competitors. So anybody that comes into the business, buy them, shut them down. And then you're a monopolist again. Somebody else enters, buy them, shut them down. Number 5, barrier to entry. Some businesses have really high sunk costs to get into business. Now, a sunk cost is any money you'd have to spend to get into a business that you can never, ever get back. So it's sunk, just as if you threw it in the ocean and it sunk to the bottom of the ocean, you're never going to get it back. Examples of sunk costs are things like if I have to build a factory, the factory might cost me $1 billion to build. But then if I wanted to sell the factory and all the equipment inside, of course I'm not going to be able to get $1 billion back, right? Just like if I bought all the seats and all the kitchen equipment to open up a restaurant, it might cost me $500,000. If I went to sell all that kitchen equipment and the tables and everything in the restaurant, I'm certainly not going to get all my money back. So some of that money is going to be sunk. So any kind of business where entrepreneurs are going to have to risk millions and millions of dollars to get into the business that they will never be able to get back, that is a deterrent. That's a barrier to entry. An example of this would be, suppose I wanted to start a software company and I wanted to get in there and compete with Microsoft and create a new operating system that was going to be used on computers. What am I going to have to do? Well, I'm going to have to hire thousands of computer programmers, get a lot of buildings, and I'm going to have to invest millions, if not billions of dollars in the software company writing this computer code that's going to be the operating system for computers. And if it doesn't work out, what if people just don't like my operating system? What if it doesn't ever catch on? Just about every dime of that money that you've spent investing in that computer code is going to be sunk. It's going to be totally gone. So this is one of the barriers to people getting in and competing with Microsoft and a lot of the software. Now, Microsoft will tell you that they are monopolists because of item number 6 here. They would say that they are just technologically superior to everyone else. Why is Microsoft Office and Excel and Word and all those kinds of things, why are they a monopolist in this for all practical purposes? Microsoft's answer, we're just better than everybody else. No one else can create programs that are as good as ours, and therefore we're a monopolist. That's probably not the right answer, but it's an answer. So if you could produce things better, more cheaply, or of higher quality than any of your competitors, that might drive them all out of business, and then you could be a monopolist. Item number 7, economies of scale. Remember that economies of scale means that as you scale up your business, as you get more land, labor, and capital and more entrepreneurship, in short, as your business gets larger and larger and larger and larger, your average total cost gets lower and lower and lower. That's really what economies of scale means. You get more and more efficient as you get larger and larger and produce more and more units. This kind of example where you have a business where the economies of scale kind of never run out, we call a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly means the bigger, the cheaper you can produce. So it is just more efficient for there to be one big firm producing all the units than to have 100 little firms producing units. It's cheaper to have one firm. It's much more efficient to have one firm. So it's only natural that you would have a monopoly. Natural monopolies, we usually see have this characteristic: really high fixed costs to get into business, but then very low marginal costs. Let me give you an example. Think about a power company, say Duke Power. Duke Power, if you wanted to start a power company in a region, what are you going to have to do? Well, you're going to have to spend billions of dollars building a huge generation facility. Lots of smokestacks and lots of generators. And then you're going to have to spend billions of dollars running wires from the generation facility across town to everybody's house. So these are all fixed costs. You have to build the huge generator. You have to have the wires before you even produce the first bit of electricity and deliver it to your customers. So those are fixed costs, huge fixed costs. But how about the marginal cost of producing one more kilowatt hour of electricity? It's tiny. It's hardly anything at all. And so what happens as you produce more and more units, the average fixed cost gets lower and lower and lower and lower, right? But those fixed costs start off so high, you need to produce millions of units to get the average fixed cost to be a reasonable amount. And the marginal cost is so cheap, might cost you a penny to generate each additional kilowatt hour of electricity. The more you can produce, the cheaper and the more efficient you're going to be. So this is one of the rationales for why in most regions we only have one choice for a power producer. It wouldn't make sense to have a lot of power companies and a lot of power lines running to different people's houses. We have one cable company. Doesn't make sense to have a lot of different cable lines running to different people's houses. We only have one water company, etc. So these things we usually call public utilities. They're government regulated. So they are monopolies. The Duke Powers and the water company. Water company is very often owned by a city or a county, but not always. If it's a private business, it's a monopoly, but we don't let them charge anything they want for water. And we don't let the power company charge any amount they would like for power. They're regulated. So even though they're a monopoly, they're not allowed to charge any price they want, and they're not allowed to make a huge profit. The last example I'm going to give of a barrier to entry, or how can you become a monopoly, is to form a cartel. So I want you to think about where you've heard the word cartel before. You've probably heard of a drug cartel. So what does a cartel mean if there's a drug cartel? Well, literally what a cartel means is when you have a lot of businesses that are competing, but then they decide, hey, let's stop fighting. Let's all get together and cooperate, and let's act like we're a monopoly. So this is what drug cartels are. It's when you have a lot of smaller drug gangs or drug production firms, instead of fighting and trying to undercut each other on price, they all get together and cooperate, and by cooperating, they're acting like a monopoly. So this happens in other businesses as well. If you had a lot of small firms that were out there producing, instead of competing with each other, they could get together and form a cartel and all cooperate. And by cooperating, instead of fighting each other and continuing to try to undercut each other's prices, they could all agree, hey, let's cut back production a little bit and let's all raise our prices some, and that way we can make more money. Now, in the United States, doing this is generally illegal. So cartels are not going to work in the United States, but in some other countries, maybe it's not illegal. So let me share with you one example about how monopolies have advertised in order to increase the demand for their product. And remember, demand represents the willingness and ability of people to buy. De Beers is a company that used to, it's not so true anymore, but used to control most of the diamond production and sales in the world. At one point, they controlled about 90% of the diamond production. And De Beers wasn't really one company, it was a cartel. And so, in addition to reducing the quantity, what De Beers would do is when members of the cartel would mine diamonds, they would hold back most of the production and not sell it. And they would just lock it away in safes. So by reducing the quantity, they were able to make diamonds seem rarer than they are. They're actually not as rare as many other apparently less rare stones, like sapphires and emerald. But because of this cartel and a lot of the price games that they were able to play by cooperating, reducing the quantity and pushing up the price, diamonds are more expensive in the market. But here's how they had an advertising campaign. You don't see these as much anymore. But if you've ever heard of this rule of thumb about how much should I spend on an engagement ring for when I propose to someone, De Beers, they're the people who came up with this idea. And they used to have commercials on all the time that said, the diamond engagement ring. How else could 2 months' salary last forever? Now imagine any other product advertising and trying to convince people that if you're not spending at least 2 months' salary for this product, you're a chump and you're not doing it right. By advertising this way, it convinced both men and women that, hey, oh wow, I was only going to spend, I don't know, like half a month's salary for a diamond ring. I'm doing it wrong. I need to be more willing and more able to pay more. And that significantly shifted the demand curve out for diamonds, and they were able to charge a lot more for diamond rings and things like that. Now, in the last video, we talked about this, but let's quickly review this idea of marginal revenue. I'm not going to spend as long on it today as I did in the previous video. But the most important thing when you're studying a monopoly is to make sure you understand the idea of marginal revenue. So let's go through it again quickly here and then use it so that we see how marginal revenue is used by a monopoly to make decisions. So marginal revenue just means the additional revenue from selling one more unit. Suppose I'm a monopolist and I have a straight line demand. Marginal revenue is also going to be a straight line when we graph it, but it's going to be a straight line with twice the slope. And we need to remember that marginal revenue is less than the price. So let's look at this little table over here to remind ourselves about marginal revenue. So over here I have the first part of a demand schedule, prices 100 down to 96, quantities just going up by 1, simple demand schedule here. And I have total revenue calculated, price times quantity. So 100 times 0 is 0, 99 times 1 is 99, 98 times 2 is 96, etc. And we need to calculate the marginal revenue. Now, as usual, we don't calculate marginal revenue for 0 units, but we want to calculate the additional revenue for the first unit. And when we sell that first unit, our total revenue goes from 0 to 99, so the additional revenue is $99. When we produce the second unit, our revenue goes from 99 to 196, so that additional revenue is 196 minus 99, or $97. The marginal revenue for the third unit, 291 minus 196 is 95. Marginal revenue of the fourth unit, 384 minus 291 is $93. So the idea here is, since we're a monopolist, if we want to sell more units than we did today, tomorrow, we have to lower our price tomorrow. And when we lower our price, the additional revenue we bring in is less than the actual price we're charging, right? So here, the marginal revenue is 97 when we're charging a price of 98. And the marginal revenue is 95 when we're charging 97. Marginal revenue is 93 when we're charging 96 when we sell that fourth unit. And the important thing to notice here is that whenever price goes down by 1, marginal revenue is going down by 2. Marginal revenue goes down twice as fast. So when we look at what's going on here in a market, this is graphing that same demand curve in blue. And I just made up this supply curve here. Suppose we were talking about pure competition, just to start with. What happens in pure competition is there's a market price where supply intersects demand, and the market price here is going to be $40. What happens in pure competition? Well, remember that perfectly competitive firms, they're going to keep producing those units as long as the price is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. And remember that marginal cost is very closely related to the supply curve. As long as that price of 40, the red, is above the additional cost of producing, the green, these perfectly competitive or purely competitive firms are going to keep producing and keep producing and keep producing, and they're going to keep producing until we get to where they're producing 60 units. So the 60 units might be produced by 10 or 15, 20 different firms in the market. That would be the pure competition result. What about in a monopoly? Well, as we saw, the monopoly doesn't have a market price. The monopoly is concerned with this marginal revenue that we were deriving over here. And as we see here, each time the quantity goes up by 1, when the price is going down by 1, the marginal revenue is going down twice as fast. So marginal revenue is dropping by 2. So if we want to draw the marginal revenue curve that the monopolist is going to be looking at here, what we want to do is draw a straight line. And the straight line is going to start up here at $100 and a quantity of 0, just like the demand curve does. But the marginal revenue curve is going to go down twice as fast. And so if the demand curve intersects the quantity axis at 100 units, a line that goes down twice as fast is going to intersect the quantity axis at 50 units. So let's draw that marginal revenue curve in there. All right, marginal revenue. So since the monopoly, they have a similar kind of rule. They want to keep producing units as long as, not the price this time, but as long as the additional revenue coming in from selling another unit, that's this purplish line, as long as that marginal revenue is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. And the logic here is that we want to produce the 10th unit because the additional revenue coming in is about $80, and the additional cost of producing it is only about $20. If it costs us $20 and we can get another $80 from selling it, we want to do that. And then the 20th unit, the additional revenue coming in is about $60, but the additional cost is under $25. So we want to keep doing that. And then the 30th unit, additional revenue coming in is $40, and the additional cost is somewhere between $25 and $30 down here. So we want to keep producing all those units. And then we want to stop right here where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And what the monopolist wants to do is look down at their quantity axis here and see how many units that is when they should stop. To me, that looks like it's about 35-ish. And then the monopolist wants to look up at the demand curve and see what's the highest price they can charge for those 35 units each. And it looks like, if we look over here to the left, it looks like the monopoly price would be $65 a piece. So when we compare what would a purely competitive market do to what would a pure monopoly do, the result is always going to be the same. The monopoly is always going to charge a higher price, in this case $65 instead of $40, and they're always going to produce less. Instead of 60 units, only 35. And that's going to create a deadweight loss right over here, this triangle. So this deadweight loss is total surplus that is not going to be going to consumers or producers anymore because the monopoly has taken over, And the monopoly is not producing as long as people's willingness and ability to pay, the demand curve, is bigger than or equal to the cost of producing units. So this is going to create inefficiency, and we're going to have a deadweight loss. So why are monopolies bad? Why would an economist not like monopolies? Well, first of all, they make persistent profits. And it's not the fact that they're making profits that we don't like. It's the fact that they're going to make profits forever, and the fact that they're making profits is causing inefficiency. It's causing deadweight loss. And because there's got to be some barrier keeping firms out, they're going to be making these profits forever and creating inefficiencies forever. And again, it's not the profit that we don't like. It's the fact that they're getting that profit by cutting the quantity and by raising the price and creating that deadweight loss. So by the way they're doing it, consumer surplus is going to go down by a lot more than their profit goes up. It's kind of like when a monopolist raises the price and cuts the quantity, their profit is only going up by $1 for every $2 they're reducing total surplus. So that's where that deadweight loss is coming from. Another problem we found with monopolists is that monopolists waste a lot of money, a lot of resources to try to create more barriers to entry. We mentioned advertising before. There's also some evidence that historically banks, sometimes you'll look at some pictures of old bank buildings and you'll see, even in a small town, it'll be this huge building with large marble columns. And the idea for the bank was to spend so much money building the bank building that it would scare other people off. And you don't need marble columns and a fancy building to be a bank. But if there are two banks in town, and one of them looks nice and fancy, like you can trust them, and the other bank doesn't spend that money, people will think that they're kind of sketchy, kind of shady. So by spending a lot of money on unnecessary advertising and wasteful building of huge buildings and creating barriers to entry, another example of wasting money to create a barrier to entry is campaign donations. Monopolists are more likely to spend millions and millions of dollars giving money to congressmen or giving money to other politicians so that those politicians will help them to stay a monopoly, to help create more barriers to keep competition out. And once you're a monopolist, monopolies are usually less responsive to customers and they're generally less efficient. If you're a purely competitive firm and you want to stay in business, you have to be on your toes. You have to be watching what other people are doing and continually try to figure out ways to cut costs and do things better. If you're a monopoly and a customer comes in and they're dissatisfied, who cares? Where are they going to go, right? They can't go to anybody else, so you can treat them like dirt, and there's not a lot they can do. So think about some of the monopolies that you've dealt with. The cable company, the phone company, the power company, Microsoft. How responsive are they to customers versus how responsive might they be if they had some real competition that you could go to? Now, monopolies aren't all bad. How can monopolies actually be good, though? Well, I want you to think really quickly. What would happen if we just did away with patents and copyrights? Again, patents and copyrights allow people to be monopolists, at least for a little while. So what if we did away with patents for things like new drugs? What if we did away with copyrights for software or music or movies? What might happen? Well, what would probably happen is you're not going to have people investing millions of dollars developing the new drug or creating that new movie if they're not going to have a chance to be able to make their money back. If I'm going to create a movie and then I know that everybody's just going to be able to copy it and sell it for free, I'm not going to invest that money in making that movie. So if you want to do away with some kinds of monopolies that result from patents and copyrights, I hope you're going to get used to not having good movies and maybe not have people develop new drugs anymore. And this relates to the second idea. It's only because of monopolists, because of the patents, that we have a lot of the drugs that we have. And we complain about the drug companies and how these prescription drugs are so expensive. But suppose we just force all the drug manufacturers to cut their prices by 90%. What's going to happen? Well, these drug companies are going to know that whenever they spend millions of dollars to invent a new drug, they know they're not going to be able to get that money back. And so drug companies are going to be likely to cut their investment in research and development. And while we'll have a good time with cheap drugs right now, we're not going to have the risk taking and the invention and all the hard work in inventing new drugs that goes on if we don't allow them to get their money back. And lastly, monopolies can be good because with a natural monopoly, it's actually the most efficient way to have one firm produce. But instead of allowing that monopoly to charge any price they want and to reduce the quantity they produce and jack the price up, we want to have a regulated monopoly. So we want to have the monopoly regulated so that they charge a reasonable price, where they can make a reasonable amount of profit. So the last topic for today is price discrimination. Most of the time we've been focusing on a monopoly and assuming that this monopoly has to charge one price to everybody. We call that a single price monopoly. There are a lot of different ways that monopolies can make more money, though, than they can by charging just one price to everybody, and that's by price discrimination. So let me give you a quick example of price discrimination. Price discrimination just means we're going to charge some people one price and some people a different price. And ideally, what we're going to be able to do is to make separate markets. And we're going to separate the markets based on how much people are willing to pay. So suppose we have two groups. One group has a lot of money, and they're willing to pay a lot of money for our good. Their demand curve is pretty high. So here's a demand curve going from $100 intersecting the price axis down to 100 on the quantity axis. And the example I have in mind here is, suppose you're a drug company and you have some antibiotic that you've invented and you're a monopolist. Let's look at human antibiotics. So this is the demand curve for humans. What is your willingness and ability to pay for antibiotics to keep you healthy or to get rid of a disease? Over here, we have a lower demand curve, which represents a lower willingness and ability of people to pay for antibiotics for animals. So these antibiotics might be used in cows or pigs or chickens. And I'm going to show an image here of an antibiotic that is something that's used on humans. It's also used in animals. And this version we're looking at says for animal use only. So this is a way that they segment the market into two groups. You have one channel where you're supposed to get your human drugs. You have another channel where you're supposed to buy drugs for animals. And they try to keep those two separated and try to make people believe, whether it's true or not, but try to make people believe that, oh, well, these pills are only for animals and these pills are only for people. And they're going to charge more for the people drugs than they are for the animal drugs, even though in many cases they come off the same production line and they're the exact same chemicals. So when the firms separate the markets here, it allows them to charge a high price to people who are willing and able to pay more, and a lower price to people who are willing and able to pay less. So let's look at how a monopolist might do this. So suppose first we just focus on, hey, I've invented a drug and it's going to be used on humans. I determine the demand curve for humans for this drug. Being a monopolist, we draw our marginal revenue curve. So again, remember, marginal revenue curve starts up here at a price of 100 and a quantity of 0, but then it has twice the slope. So if this demand curve intersects the quantity axis at 100, the marginal revenue curve is going to intersect at 50. So there's our marginal revenue curve. Now, if you are a single price monopolist and you're just focused on this one market, then of course you're going to keep producing as long as marginal revenue is above marginal cost. Now in this case, I made the marginal cost very simple. I assumed that our production line can crank off another dose of this antibiotic at a constant $20 per unit. So the marginal cost is always $20, no matter how many we're producing. So if that's the case, the monopolist is going to look and continue produce as long as the additional money coming in on the red line is greater than or equal to the additional cost of producing it, and then they're going to stop right here. So the quantity they would want to produce would be 40 units. And then they look up at the demand curve to see what's the highest price I could charge for these 40 million doses of this antibiotic. And it looks like it's $60 per dose over here. Now here's the interesting thing. This monopolist could probably make a lot of profit by doing this. However, if they charge $60 per dose, let's look over here at the market for animals. If you're a farmer and somebody wants to charge $60 for an antibiotic for your pigs or your chickens or your cows, you're just not interested. You're not willing or able to pay $60 per dose. At $50, this farmer would be out. Or maybe this is all farmers would be out of the market and not want to buy any. But if we can separate the market and have some bottles labeled for human use only and some bottles labeled for animal use only, then in this separate market, you treat it just like it's a separate product. And so it has its own demand curve. And so you would want to draw your marginal revenue curve. And the marginal revenue curve for the veterinary market or the animal market is going to start here at a price of 50 and a quantity of 0. And it's going to go down. Instead of intersecting the x-axis, the quantity axis at 50, it will intersect halfway, twice as fast at 25. So here's your marginal revenue curve for the monopolist. And as always, the monopolist rule is keep producing as long as the additional revenue in this market coming in is bigger than the additional cost of $20 of producing each unit, and then stop producing. And then you look down at the quantity axis to see at what quantity does that happen. It looks like it's 15,000 or 15 million units. And then the monopolist looks up at the demand curve to figure out what is the highest price I can charge for these 15 million units per unit, right? So it looks like in the animal market, I'm going to be charging $35 per dose. And by doing that, you're not ruling out anybody from the animal market buying your product. You get the profits from the human market, selling 40 million units at $60 a piece, and you get to include this other market that would not be involved if you charged everyone the same price. So by price discriminating, charging some people higher prices and other people lower prices, you can accomplish higher profits. So the way you've probably seen this done in practice is by giving certain kinds of people discounts. Examples you've probably seen are giving student discounts for movie tickets, student discounts for software, or senior citizen discounts, for example. And the idea here is that if Microsoft charged everyone the same price for Microsoft Office, then there are a lot of people who just would not be able to afford it, especially people like students or teachers. So this is why they have student and teacher editions that are much, much cheaper. And as long as the price they're charging is higher than the marginal cost, what do you think the marginal cost is for Microsoft to allow another person to download a copy of Microsoft Office? It's probably pennies, right? All they're doing is downloading a file from the internet. So as long as they can charge you $100 that you as a student would never have paid them at all if they were charging you the $1,000 they were charging big corporations, that's more money in their pocket. That's a higher profit that they get by charging different people different prices. All right, I'm going to end this video here. This is just a collection of a lot of interesting things about monopolies that you need to know. Of course, the most interesting thing, as I mentioned in the previous video, is a real good understanding of marginal revenue for the monopolist and how that works. So we've reviewed that in a few different ways. We talked about how monopolies can be bad or monopolies can also be good, especially if it is an incentive to someone to create something new by getting a patent or a copyright. We talked about the deadweight loss that comes from being a monopoly, and we talked about barriers to entry and some examples of how monopolies could get formed and how some barriers might be put up to keep other people from entering. So this is Dr. Berkey signing out. Thank you for joining me. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll try to help you out. Otherwise, I wish you the best of luck in your studies, and I hope you join me next time. Bye-bye.